Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar on energy disputes by Hewitt Decipher Partnership. Thank you for joining our webinar today. My name is Paul Gibbons and I am one of the founding directors of Hewitt Decipher Partnership. We have over 130 people who have registered for today's event, which is great. So it's lovely to have you all join us, and we look forward to sharing our views on energy disputes with you all. The webinar will consist of a presentation from Theresa Mohammad, and she will be discussing preparations for disputes on energy projects. And then there'll be a session or a presentation by Tom Francis, and he will discuss the challenges with analysing delays on energy projects. We will then have a panel discussion chaired by my fellow director at Hewitt Decipher, Andy Hewitt, and he will be joined by John Shenton, Philip Boulding QC, and Theresa and Tom. And they will discuss energy disputes, and we would welcome any questions that you may have at the end of the panel. So please put them either in the Q&A or the chat, and we will try and pick those up before the end of the session. So moving on, I'm very pleased to be joined today with Theresa Mohammad. Theresa is a partner at Trowers and Hamlins, specialising in contentious construction. She has extensive experience of acting for employers and main contractors, and has experience of running high court trials, instructing experts on technical engineering matters, resolving construction disputes through mediation, and drafting settlement agreements. Theresa has acted for clients in domestic and international arbitrations, and frequently works with international clients in contentious proceedings. She's also the chair of the National Association of Women in Construction, is on the board of Women in Social Housing, and was awarded Best Woman in Construction Law at the European Women and Construction Engineering Awards in 2017. I'm also joined by John Shenton. John is the contracts manager at Hitachi ABB Power Grids. John has acted for developers, consultants and contractors, and he has a keen interest in project finance and holds a Masters of Business Engineering from Stuttgart, in addition to a Masters of Law from Paris, Descartes and Sorbonne, Abu Dhabi. John is chair of Novus and vice chair of the Dubai Hub, and sits on the MENA Hub and the Business Development Board for the Chartered Institute of Building. I'm also pleased to be joined by Philip Boulding QC. Philip is a barrister at Keating Chambers based in Asia. He has over 40 years experience specialising in the fields of construction engineering, technology law and related professional negligence work. Philip's practice comprises primarily international arbitration work, and his clients include local authorities, government departments, major national and international construction engineering companies, energy and utility companies and developers. Philip is also a Tech Bar accredited adjudicator and renowned international arbitrator. He has recently acted as chairman of the DIAC Arbitral Tribunal in Dubai in relation to disputes arising from the construction of gas production facility in Iraq. I'm also pleased to be joined by Tom Francis, who's an expert in project planning and forensic delay analysis. He is a director of Decipher and manages a team of planning and delay specialists. This team provides tender, live planning and expert witness services to clients from businesses across the process, building and civil engineering sectors. And for over a decade, Tom has worked with leading expert teams specialising in negotiation, adjudication and arbitration. He's had previous times at Mace, Knowles, and is now at Decipher, and this has allowed him to hone his skills and knowledge. And Tom's particular interest is demystifying complex infrastructure disputes, and he is experienced in live project planning and delay analysis. And Tom has particular skill in developing robust programs and correct assessments of compensation events. And finally, Andy Hewitt joins us. He is the managing director of Hewitt Decipher. Again, Andy has over 40 years of experience in the construction industry. He has worked on many iconic projects worldwide and has lived and worked in the Middle East for more than 20 years. Andy has held senior contracts management, commercial management and project management positions, and his career has seen him working with contractors, subcontractors and consultants. Years of first-hand experience within the industry have led Andy to specialise in the field of contractual issues, claims and disputes. So that is the panel of esteemed individuals. I will now hand over to Theresa to talk us through her presentation on preparing for energy disputes. So if I can ask the other panelists to please turn their videos off whilst Theresa is doing her video. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. The next section is about preparing for disputes. Could I go to the next slide, please? Okay, so disputes, sorry, that one, thank you. Disputes are a reality of the sector, and the way they seem to work is the more prepared you are, the less likely you are to actually end up in a dispute. And if you do end up in a dispute, the reality is they'll probably resolve themselves at an earlier stage. There have been various papers published on global construction disputes, and certainly some of the industry bodies have identified that the average value of a construction dispute is around £22 million over $30 million US, and the time taken to resolve by way of legal proceedings is around 15 months. Now that's 15 months of very involved time spent instructing experts, instructing counsel, and working on for many hours on these cases. It's not a matter of starting a legal process and then coming back to it at the end. When you are running large and complex energy construction disputes, the legal and expert costs can easily run to around £100,000 to £250,000 per month. Now, obviously, this can considerably fluctuate, but that just shows you the sort of scale of the legal spend. Can I have the next slide, please? We have identified some causes of claims and disputes, the energy sector clearly working with the construction sector to deliver energy projects. Anything from district heating projects, utilities to renewable energy, oil and gas, and nuclear energy. While the projects, of course, are very different, there are some prevalent issues that you'll probably recognise. Amongst some of the issues you immediately see, there is a tendency for parties to try and renegotiate the terms of the contract once it's already been executed, and there is often a misunderstanding of how termination rights work. You will also see that payment, cost overruns are an obvious source of dispute, as well as deficiencies in workmanship. There can also be the frequent presentation of unsubstantiated claims, which of course will damage commercial relationships, trust, and that in turn will lead to disputes. Other prevalent issues are a failure to administer the contract and generally a failure to understand or comply with contractual obligations. Now, regular training on the contract itself can of course help to alleviate this. And lots of commentators have actually cited this as their number one cause of disputes. Now, the next slide, please. An important first job, of course, is to try and understand what you're going to sign up to. Even if your negotiation position is very limited, understanding the risks you'll face will give you a chance to manage them. There is also the problem of potential design coordination on site and the poor management of subcontractors and suppliers, which will drive the parties to dispute. Can I have the next slide, please? So, of course, there are many dispute avoidance techniques, and it's important to be familiar with them. Now, obviously, this may be enshrined in the contract, but the other point is making sure that you continue the risk management process and consider, where appropriate, dispute escalation provisions, which usually involve things like director-to-director meetings over a short period of time and taking disputes away from the people that actually are engaged in the dispute. So the focus can be on resolution rather than liability or blaming each other. There will also usually be the opportunity to mediate and explore non-adversarial forms of resolution that can actually nip problems in the bud early and allow focus to resume on the project. Now, of course, some of these are quite painful and you may feel quite aggrieved participating in them, but the point is the project is the priority, not blame or resolving personal issues. Next slide, please. So even if you believe that you have a claim, and even if you feel very confident in what your position is and you feel that you understand the contract, the early onboarding of experts and counsel can be extremely useful so that you can make sure that you've got a clear strategy and understanding of your legal rights. If you don't, there is a risk that many months or years down the line, there will be concerns raised over an approach taken, or that claims could have been made that weren't, or that actually a legal position may have been compromised. Of course, nobody wants to hear, oh, with the benefit of hindsight, I would have done things differently. That's the last thing you want to hear years into a dispute. It will also be very important to preserve documents. Now, this just doesn't mean the good ones. A lot of clients may make that mistake. This isn't just about documents that help improve your position or, put you in a very good light. This means properly retaining documentation so that your legal team can advise you on risk and can understand the full picture. This may also be a requirement of the relevant disclosure obligations that you are subject to and may cause significant problems if documents that would have been available are no longer within your possession. A common problem that I face on cases is late disclosure of documents that should have been in a client's possession. And then of course, the risk profile of the case can completely change overnight for the better or for the worse. It will also be useful to speak to relevant witnesses in case they move company, which means that their cooperation may not be forthcoming. It could also mean that they've forgotten important facts. It could mean that they've taken documents on laptops or other devices that are then lost and then have to be belatedly disclosed. We have found that obtaining witness evidence from witnesses once they are ensconced in a news role is usually more challenging and will certainly be the case that there's a real risk if they've been cross-examined over activities taken years before. It's just natural that, once someone's moved company, they want to focus on their new role and pretty much forget about what's gone on before. And next slide, please. Believe it or not, locating the executed contract is actually more challenging than you may think. This happens time and time again on projects, and that goes for the program and as-built data and important things like time-stamped photographs. Tom, for example, will be able to tell you how crucial that is. The most common problems that we see are documents that are obtained actually in huge number, but they're littered with duplicates. They're full of irrelevant other documents. They're potentially corrupted, and this becomes extremely costly and time-consuming to unravel. Anyone that's undertaken a disclosure exercise will tell you this, and it seems to be prevalent in the sector. Next slide, please. As it will also be obvious to those of us who have worked with leading counsel or have worked or acted for any parties in litigation or arbitration, you will be repeatedly asked for contemporaneous documentation, documents that record actually what was happening as it was happening. Meeting minutes, board reports, evidence of why decisions were made. And you will need to carefully record with narratives any management time spent dealing with disputes if you want the chance to recover that. It's really no good trying to guess after the event and trying to sort of allocate costs and time after the event. That will not be persuasive. Next slide, please. So in summary, disputes are expensive. They're often long-term, and they're not what you're there for. They are a huge diversion from your real job. Understanding the contract and the risk you're taking is key. Surprises cause disputes, and you will have potentially lost your chance to manage the risk in advance. If you can't avoid the dispute or nip it in the bud, onboard your expert team early so that you can plan and execute the right strategy. Thanks.
Thank you, Theresa. Some insightful knowledge there, and thank you for sharing your views. That was really useful. Right, I will now hand over to Tom, who's going to discuss the challenges that he faces and sees on energy projects with analysing delays. So, Tom, I hand over the baton to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, good afternoon to all the attendees from around the world. Just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see these slides. So as the introduction earlier, my name is Tom Francis. I'm Head of Project Controls within Hewitt Decipher Partnership. I'm going to give you a brief presentation, 10 minutes or so, on our experience as a business operating in the delay sector, particularly around disputes revolving time. What I propose to go through is firstly just to pose that question of how big an issue is delay and time risk within the energy and power sector. Then to go through some of the common delays that we as a business come up against time and time again, particularly when we deal with EPC forms of contract. And then to consider delay analysis and some pointers towards how to undertake a delay analysis in this area. So if we first just deal with the first point, I guess, how big a problem is it? Well, I've done a little bit of research, and as you can see from these slides, there's been a few papers presented by firms such as Ernst & Young and KPMG around the delays prevalent in this sector. If you look firstly at the slide or the image to the top right, you can see the world map, which shows that for those of us operating in the Middle East, typically projects are 22 months over schedule on average and 36% over budget. This compares with what occurs in Asia Pacific and Europe, and slightly better than that seen in the Americas, which seems to have bigger problems, both North and South America, in terms of delayed completion and being over budget. When we consider the image on the top left, you can see that this does vary by type of project. Nuclear, hydro, coal-fired, particularly delayed, particularly over budget. I'm sure that resonates with many of those listening and your experiences in those specific projects on this call today. Somewhat better than offshore wind, possibly a simpler type of project, which is less delayed and less over budget. Equally, if you draw upon the report in the bottom left, which is from KPMG, this is in 2015, what their report showed that underperforming projects, there was 71% of underperforming projects from the survey they did in this particular sector, one of the worst sectors from the survey that they undertook. And equally, bottom right, you can see a report from the UK market looking at oil and gas projects, typically 10 to 13 month overrun on the projects that they surveyed. So what do I draw from this? Well, clearly the energy and power sector has an issue with delayed completion. That's certainly our experience from the projects that we come across. Obviously, we see delays across all sectors, but this sector in particular has its unique challenges. What then are those challenges and what do we typically see? Well, if we break it into phases of a project, if we start with the design and procurement phase, one of the key issues I've come across on many projects is the challenge between the procurement department of an EPC contractor and its project delivery team. Procurement often strive for lowest cost, breaking up of packages into smaller works, direct cost savings, and have significant sway and influence in that regard. However, from my experience, this can lead to many site claims, uncoordinated systems, and challenges on site in integrating those various individually supplied pieces of equipment or systems. And I think it's somewhat of a false economy at the end of the project, where the direct cost savings are often offset by the disputes, the claims that arise on site thereafter. So something perhaps to consider in that regard. Equally, when we deal with the feed design, the front end engineering design, this is typically a design passed from employer to contractor at an early phase. The contractor is left with a detailed design. This often overlaps with the construction phase. The program is unnecessary tight. There's no time allowed for perhaps resubmittals of that design, detailed design and such like. And what we found is that scope change, design errors, rework arise as a result. And typically, a significant cause of delay to the critical delay to the project arises from this challenge between the design being incomplete and the construction works trying to proceed. Final note I'd make in terms of the design phase is design milestones. These are often achieved in terms of date because there's some payment due upon that deliverable, perhaps as a bonus payment. Equally, there may be liquidated damages applicable to that date. There's an onus to get that date achieved. But from my experience, quite often that design is lacking, it's incomplete, and there is a debate between the parties thereafter, particularly the party receiving that design, whether it's actually complete and whether they can actually proceed, and delay then arises as a result. If we consider then the construction phase, a couple of key points I would draw upon from my experience is firstly, the challenge between civil works and process installation. I've seen many a project fail as a result of uncoordination between these two key deliverables. Civil works often plays second stage to the process equipment, in my experience. Why is that? I guess because process equipment is long lead-in items, significant value, and it's being delivered on a set date. As a result, quite often the civil contractors have to work around that deliverable and that process equipment being installed. This can lead to delay and challenges thereafter. You can see from this kind of flow chart that I present here that civil works are often involved in the foundations, perhaps the plinths, for the process equipment to be installed upon. They may then return to do any remaining steelwork or cladding around the particular building. And then we lead into the process taking hold again in terms of commissioning. Clearly a lot of interfaces, clearly a lot that can go wrong, which does go wrong. Another point on this I would make is lay-down areas. I've seen many an instance where the process equipment arrives, takes up and constrains the whole site. All of the ancillary civil buildings are left till later on in the project, where they're not a key priority. And obviously this can lead to further delays to any civil contractors. Equally in the construction phase, probably the other challenge I see is employer deliverables, particularly vendor equipment. Quite often the employer will hold on to the contracts with specific vendor equipment. These run long lead-in periods, many, many months. There's a small selection of key suppliers globally for delivery of those units. They're not easily replaceable from the local market. And clearly this presents a huge delay risk from overseas sourcing of this equipment. We've particularly seen this problem rising recently in relation to COVID. Equipment being stuck in ports, unable to be delivered to the other country. So a couple of key areas there that I've certainly experienced in the construction phase. If we then finally just consider briefly the commissioning and takeover phase, this in my mind is probably the biggest risk for any EPC contractor. I have seen examples of well progressing projects during the construction phase essentially lose significant periods of time when it gets to commissioning. And as a result, that contractor is liable for a very large sum of liquidated damages. Why is that? Well, I think many contractors don't plan the commissioning phase early enough, perhaps don't appreciate the intricacies of systems, whereas they've got an approach of building it building by building initially. Other issues that have arisen are as listed, particularly punch lists, resolving those items, which can run into the many tens of thousands in some cases. Disagreement of the liability, resolving those issues prior to pre-commissioning or commissioning. Equally, I've seen instances of the commissioning resources being underestimated at the outset, difficulty in sourcing key resources for commissioning, and equally, as with supply of equipment, those resources can become stuck in various countries and not being able to return to the sites, particularly around COVID. We have seen issues of delay as a result of that. And then the final thing I note is deliverable issues around the feedstock and fuel that may be used on the plant. The consistency and quality of that can cause delays in balancing the plant, leading to liquidated damages as well as performance damages on certain occasions. So, drawing upon those brief slides of my experience and us as a business, how to summarise? Well, I guess obviously power and energy is notoriously complex in itself. You know, the technology is a real challenge. The systems are a challenge in constructing. Added to that are these non-technical delays that I've mentioned, things around procurement, the way contracts are let and so forth. And interesting to note that the Ernst & Young report I referenced earlier cited in their report in this sector that 65% of delays arise from those type of issues. And I think when you combine that with the technical challenge, also the fact that many projects should be process-led, based around the systems and planned around the systems, but rather are quite often planned around the buildings, a geographical area of buildings, perhaps because of the background of those constructing the project, not being particular to process, but more to the building sector. I think if you combine those two elements, what does it lead to? Well, naturally it leads to huge delays, naturally it leads to large liquidated damages being applied, and equally prolongation costs and claims from the contractors up the line. How then, I guess, do we as a business look at things from a delay perspective? Well, I suppose the first point I'd note is, whilst there's some nuances and differences from this sector to others, particularly to the sector, in terms of delay analysis, our approach is not too dissimilar to other sectors. Essentially, there's two things we do initially. One is look for the information sources. Theresa picked up upon the key requirements set out there in terms of contemporaneous documentation. Those information sources will determine what methodology of delay we can undertake. And equally, we will consider the contract provisions, whether there's any specific requirement in the contracts for a particular form of delay analysis. Another point I would make is, and Theresa picked up on this, who is maintaining the contemporaneous evidence throughout the course of the works? A real key issue, and as Theresa stated, this can lead to delay in the delay analysts commencing their works. Quite often at the outset, we'll be giving many copies of the programs, monthly updates to programs to a very high level of detail. What we need to do is to validate that data with other sources of information, particularly photographs, drone footage, daily allocation sheets and so forth. And it can take an inordinate amount of time to get hold of that information, which can delay the process. And the question I always say is, are the project controls and planning team maintaining that information, or is it the the site management team, the engineering team. Quite often there's a mismatch, or no one's really controlling it. And as I say, it's hard to get hold of, and in some cases it doesn't even exist. Final couple of points I'd raise is, certainly in my experience, there's a trend within this sector and others towards effect and cause forms of analysis, retrospective delay analysis. It's certainly not taking that over the last few years. A trend away from what we call cause and effect methods, the prospective forms of analysing delay, particularly so when the works are complete. As a result, methods such as time impact analysis, I believe, are losing favour when the works are complete. Yes, that method has its place to play during the course of the works in analysing delays on a prospective basis on an end date or a future end date that's not yet known. Does it have a place to play at the completion of the works? I'm not so sure. Having said that, we do see a number of instances of contracts specifying time impact analysis in the contracts, particularly in this sector. And obviously that brings up challenges and debate we'd have with instructing solicitors like Theresa and Philip in order to determine how we go about our delay analysis as a result of perhaps the conflict between provisions of the contract and what we should really be doing at the end of a project in terms of retrospective forms of analysis. Equally, the final point I make, specific to this sector, is concurrency clauses. I've seen many an instance of concurrency clauses in EPC forms of contract. What I mean by this is provision which states that should there be concurrent delay between the parties, no extension of time is given to the contractor, and equally liquidated damages do apply. I certainly have my views on whether EPC contractors should sign up to these forms, but obviously that's an issue around risk allocation. It certainly presents more of a challenge for the delay analyst, because equally the opposing party will always draw upon other areas of concurrency to negate giving of any form of extension of time. And as a result, liquidated damage may still be on the table. So a couple of thoughts there, perhaps specific to this sector. That's my 10 minutes run through. Thank you for listening. Hopefully you found it of interest. And I will pass you back to Paul, who will look for the commencement of the panel discussion.
Thank you, Tom. Really interesting views there, and I was pleased to receive those. I think it's safe to say that it is a particularly challenging sector. We as HDP are involved with quite a few schemes where the whole procurement department issue and the project delivery issue and engineering issue continues to play out, and there's a disconnect there about what they're trying to deliver and build, and indeed the challenges with regards to the programme. So some key points which resonate particularly with some schemes that Andy and I are working on currently. So thanks for that. Right now, I will hand over to Andy Hewitt, who's going to moderate a panel discussion. So if I can ask all the panelists to put themselves or unmute themselves, and Andy, I'll hand over the baton to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thank you very much to both Theresa and to Tom. Very, very interesting. We're looking at things from two sides of the same fence. First of all, Theresa has really put into words what Paul and I and the rest of the HDP have experienced for many years, and the causes of disputes. And to sum up, and Theresa is echoing what people like Arcadis and HKA have put in their global dispute reports, that failure to administer the contract, both by contractors and engineers stroke employers, big cause of dispute. Failure to follow the obligations of the contract, or people that don't understand what the contract means they must do or what their obligations are. And this comes down to, again, as failure to properly administer the contract from the contractor's point of view. Things like as-built records, things like submission of notices in a timely manner, things like submitting your claims as and when they should be submitted, rather than waiting till the end of the project and then realize you've got a big problem that you need help to get out of. And a lot of this comes down to, and thank you for mentioning it, Theresa, is lack of training, lack of education, and lack of qualification of the people on those projects. They simply don't know what they are doing. And that might sound harsh, but it's what we see all the time as a major cause of difficult claims and of disputes. So that's my take on it. Once again, thank you to both Tom and Theresa. And of course, sorry, not forgetting Tom. Tom's looked at things from the technical point of view, is that when the project is in a mess, why is it in a mess? And we've looked at engineering, we've looked at design, we've looked at construction, we've looked at procurement, and all these things go hand in hand. And if you've got both things going wrong at once, sorry, contractors, and in fact, employers, your project is not going to be in a good state. And then you need to spend lots of money on people like Philip and Theresa, and probably people like HDP to help you out. But sorry, on to the panel discussion. And my first question is for John. We at HDP have already been involved in extension of time claims on energy projects in the Middle East. And of course, the big issue at the moment is of course COVID. So, John, is COVID still having an influence on the processes? Are contractors more risk adverse when it comes to signing new contracts and entering into dispute proceedings?
Certainly, Andy. COVID-19 very much remains a live event in this part of the world. COVID has had a strong influence on the external project processes and the internal processes of all contractors. I would contest whether any contractor is ever truly risk averse. Contractors are by nature risk tolerant. Contractors place orders before the equipment has been approved to guarantee a manufacturing slot. They invariably start construction before the IFC documentation has been fully approved. And certainly in the case of UK contractors, I'm sitting in Dubai in 31 degrees with clear blue skies. In the UK and in Europe, major concrete pours are undertaken before the concrete test results have been returned to take advantage of good weather. Now, I sit within Hitachi ABB Power Grid's Grid Integration Business Unit. We have two business lines, one of which is services orientated, the other which is a grid integration contracting unit. We're essentially looking to mitigate the risk of the construction arrangements that we enter into with the sponsors of our projects. The higher value projects are built on a turnkey basis. They're commonly by way of an engineering, procurement and construction contract. Typically, the project sponsors will seek to shift as many of the completion risks as possible and as appropriate onto us. What that essentially means is we have to construct the plant to a fixed time, fixed cost, and to perform to a prescribed specification. And that provides a single point of responsibility for them, but also it means that we have very limited scope to compromise on those three areas. In terms of COVID-19, I think it's important to distinguish between the impact that it's had on pre-contract and sort of post-contract processes. In terms of pre-contract, we run a risk management review process for any new project that's been identified. A risk review is conducted when we identify an opportunity. We run through that and we have a high summary of the different risks that we can identify. The output from that is put into a risk mitigation strategy, and the risk mitigation strategy determines the appropriate mitigation for the individual risk events. Typically, we would be looking to either avoid a risk by excluding the risk in the contract with the end user. We may try to transfer the risk down our supply chain, or ultimately by ensuring it, or essentially we may adopt a mitigating action. Where there's no mitigatory action that can be adopted, we would, with a heavy heart, look to absorb that risk. In terms of where we execute works, we have a sensitive country protocol. We have a list of red countries. In the end, we have a new project that's coming up, and it falls into one of those countries. Maybe the end user's based there, maybe the customer's based there, maybe the site's based there. Then we have a specific approval level that's constantly under review, and we'd look at whether a trigger has been activated and whether we can actually work there. Also, then we have the issue of COVID clauses. We're obviously working on a pre-contract side to ensure that the COVID clause is inserted into every new agreement that we sign at the moment. This is essentially a mechanism that allows us to proceed with the works while ensuring that we don't remain liable if the project is delayed or there are some issues that relate either to the construction or to the commissioning of the project. We all then have a lessons learned process. So we have a portfolio of projects which were undertaken before the COVID-19 pandemic and are now drawing to a close. And then we have a smaller portfolio of projects, admittedly, which relate to our services business unit, where work was executed under a shorter program, either as the COVID pandemic was taking place, or after the COVID pandemic was declared, and those projects are drawing to a close. And there are certain lessons that we've learned from those projects that we would apply to any new opportunity that we're looking at the moment. In terms of our post-contract administration, it hasn't all been doom and gloom. The sponsors, the end users, the consultants have suddenly become very, very amenable to virtual attendance at meetings. They are open to the idea of electronic submission and review of documents and design deliverables. And we also have virtual factory acceptance tests for the key pieces of equipment that we're tending to procure from our supply chain, typically from overseas. To your final point, really, which relates to, I suppose, the litigation and arbitration of disputes. Look, financial concerns are fundamental to any decision regarding the decision to pursue disputes. Within an organization, within a contractor, the cost center of pursuing a claim under the contract, one that's moved into a dispute, will move from the project or the department that's responsible for the project to the legal cost center. And so internally, there will need to be a series of position papers and a financial risk assessment that will decide whether it is worth actually escalating a claim to a dispute. I think that covers most of your points, Andy, unless there's anything else you need clarification on.
No, thank you very much, John. And it's very interesting. I wouldn't expect really anything else from Hitachi ABB, that you're on top of these things. We come across so many clients that all of these things that you've talked about, risk management, identifying risk, dealing with things, pre-planning, etc., it just doesn't exist. Clients wait until they've got themselves into a big mess before they start to think about how to get out of it. So thank you very much, John. Next question to Philip. It's pretty common for an energy project to be located in one jurisdiction. It might be working under a contract with applicable laws of another jurisdiction, and the contractor comes from somewhere else, and subcontractors come from yet more regions. Now, this is quite typical of many projects I've worked on in the Middle East. In fact, going back to the mid-noughties, I was project director for a project management consultant, and I was working with 24 people in my team, and there were 19 different nationalities, all from different cultures, different backgrounds, and mainly different languages. And we all had to learn how to work as a team. So, Philip, how does this sort of mix of nationalities, cultures, legal systems, languages add to the complexities when it comes to dispute resolution?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a very pertinent question. I do have some observations to make on that, but before doing that, perhaps I can just be permitted to make one point in relation to the very important matter of risk that both you, Andy, and John talked about. And you made the point that there is very often a failure to administer or understand a contract often for many, many, many millions of pounds. And I never understand why at the very beginning of a job where so much is at stake, that a workshop is not organised for absolutely key personnel so they know what's got to be expected of them in terms of serving notices and so on and so forth, or indeed what's expected of the personnel who are supervising the job. For example, I've been involved for the best part of the last 2 years in a big, highly publicised commission of inquiry in Hong Kong, and I can disclose some of the evidence because it was actually on live television every day. And I was absolutely astonished that people with key supervisory functions were allowed underground to apparently supervise and inspect very, very, very important operations. And yet they told the learned commissioner that they'd never seen the specification or they didn't understand the specification. And how much better it would have been, I said to my clients, if workshops had been organised at the very beginning of the job, perhaps run by a lawyer for the legal bits, a programmer for the programming bits, and so on and so forth. So it is a point I make, And I can never understand why more effort is not put in at that part of the job. But coming on to the question that you raised with me specifically, you're absolutely right. It is indeed a common problem that under a contract, you'll often have the law of one jurisdiction with contractors and subcontractors coming from other jurisdictions. And I have to say that in my experience, it adds very considerably to the complexity and, sadly, often the time and expense of the dispute resolution process. Now, where that situation, which is a relatively common situation, occurs, I always advise, when given the opportunity to do so, that it's a problem that should be identified and indeed dealt with before the contracts, including the relevant contracts, are let and provided for, insofar as it's possible to do so, so far as the dispute resolution procedure is concerned. And as you've identified, in my respectful opinion, that dispute resolution procedure, because that's essentially what we're talking about, ought to recognise the fact that there are people from different regions, of different nationalities, and of course, most importantly, in the concept of what we're talking about, in the context of what we're talking about, the way in which the dispute is to be resolved. In my experience, I often deal with people from jurisdictions who have no idea of, for example, what the British form of discovery involves. That's a matter which Theresa has already helpfully touched upon in terms of the need to preserve documents, bring documents into existence, and so on and so forth. That procedure is completely alien to many jurisdictions that I have worked in. Similarly, civil systems often have very strict time limits for the overall conclusion of a dispute resolution procedure, which do not often exist in the common law jurisdictions. And that's something else that one has to take into account. And I'm sorry to reiterate the point I made, but it is an important point. These are points which shouldn't be left until the end of the contract and everyone's warring with each other. They should be anticipated and dealt with at the very beginning. And a key matter I found is whether or not it's permissible that subcontractors and main contractors, even though they can come from different countries, they speak different languages, could all be joined in the same dispute resolution procedure. That, when it happens unexpectedly, surprisingly it might seem, from the perspective of some of the parties, when it often happens, it is something which gives rise to considerable cause for concern. I also emphasise that arbitrators, and I do sit on occasions as an arbitrator, arbitrators, and importantly, their selection has an important role to play, so far as I am concerned, in terms of understanding different cultures, possibly speaking different languages, and the ability to explain, preferably in simple terms, aspects to the procedure, to parties to the procedure, aspects of the procedure, to parties who might be unfamiliar with them. That would be my way of dealing with it. So when I sit as an arbitrator and I have parties from different jurisdictions with different understandings of the legal process, I often spend an hour or so just explaining to both of the parties exactly what I will expect, exactly what's going to happen, so that further down the line, it comes to no surprise so far as they are concerned. I would also expect, of course, their own lawyers to do that, but I just like to make sure that insofar as I have an involvement, my role is satisfied in that regard. So I think it's an important question, and those are some of the considerations that I think are relevant. It may well be that my fellow panelists have different experiences and indeed various points to add. But that's what I'd like to say on that, Andy.
Thank you, Philip. It's a little bit scary to realise that between you and I, we've got 80 plus years experience within this industry. Thereby hangs a very pertinent phrase. It is experience. And sort of that leads me on a little bit to the next question I've got to Theresa. And I would love to answer this myself, but we just don't have enough time for all the answers I'd like to give. But in our experience, you know, we're all dealing with this, the sort of disputes. But from your point of view, what do you see as the common mistakes that are made?
Well, I think we've alluded to this already, but one thing I've seen repeatedly is complete ignorance and almost completely ignoring the contract for a long period of time. And there seems to be a genuine belief that behaving contractually will cause disputes. And clients have repeatedly said things like, if I send this notice or if I behave in a particular way, it's going to get everyone's backs up and we're going to end up in a dispute. So I've seen situations where no one's looked at the contract for a couple of years. And then when the dispute blows up, when there's an inevitable cost overrun or a huge extension of time claim or something like that, then all of a sudden it gets dusted off. There is a secondary point to this, which is, you know, do we as the lawyers and the experts in the sector, do we have a role in this? Because one of the things that keeps happening is we have highly intelligent, very skilled clients who, for whatever reason, can't get to grips with these contracts. And is it because of the way that they're being drafted? Is it something as a sector we need to look at? Because certainly things like, you know, in a slightly different context, the Construction Leadership Council, the SEC, they've been looking at COVID drafting and COVID clauses that John mentioned. And is it something actually that we need to look at? Because it seems to me that it is a constant problem that highly specialised, you know, energy contractors who are excellent at their actual job, at the actual work, cannot seem to get to grips with the administration of a contract.
Yeah, it's thank you for that, and thank you for listing the mistakes so succinctly. But yeah, the failure to understand the contract, failure if you do understand it, and I think there's some people play a game, they pretend not to understand it so they can act outside it.
Well, that's true, Andy. But one thing that I saw that was quite interesting on a project was it was a contract. It was a big contract. You know, very lots and lots of pages, very carefully drafted. And to me or to you, it would have been fairly straightforward. It's a big project, big energy project in the UK, and actually, you know, as contracts go, wasn't too bad. Let's put it that way. But what the engineers on site had done was create a table with every clause, and then they'd explained it in there and what they described as their own words afterwards. So they'd literally copied it all out and then tried to explain, sort of paraphrased colloquially, what it actually meant. And I thought, for them to have to do that, something's going wrong, because, you know, these are very highly qualified people. And to me, it seemed very easy to deal with. But for them, it was, you know, this is a different language we're speaking. So I just, you know, I just wondered whether, you know, aside from obviously the gamesmanship that may go on, is there a wider point that we need to consider?
I think, and again, I'm going to butt in a little bit and take over, but, you know, a contractor, or in fact the engineer supervising consultant or whatever, they'll put resources, they'll spend money on construction people, safety people, because it's law, this person, that person. And again, in our experience, probably, you know, we're a little bit biased because we do tend to get involved in projects that have gone wrong. But when it comes down to people who can advise them, who can administer, who can manage the contract itself, it's a case of, we don't have the money for that, so let's go cheap. And of course, it's not cheap in the long run, because if you're losing money on your project, or you have liquidated damages or delay penalties applied, that's certainly not cheap. If you've got to employ Theresa or Philip or HDP, that's not going to be cheap either. So anyway, sorry, I must move on, because I know we are running out of time here, and I want to give the opportunity to ask a question from Tom. And it's a frequent thing that comes up, a key issue. And that is always, 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 we tell our clients don't understand it, but to demonstrate causation. So, you know, in terms of demonstrating delay and the cause and effect, can modern technology be helpful, particularly when we are moving on to dispute resolution rather than, you know, project-based? Have you seen any good examples of technology being put to use recently? And as a young guy, I probably won't understand what you're going to say, because technology tends to defeat us older guys, doesn't it, Philip?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I think when you mean technology, Andy, I think when you say new technology, I think in the context of delay, you're referring perhaps to 4D planning, visualization, which is a trend that's emerging, certainly in what we do, although it's still quite early days in my experience. I think in terms of live projects, 4D planning is perhaps used more prevalently than in disputes. It's only really used on the mega projects. When I say mega project, I mean stadiums, very large energy plants. On occasion, I've seen it. The issue being those 4D models are quickly out of date, and the whole site planning team generally revert back to traditional planning tools such as Primavera. I think in the context of disputes, I think the first thing I say is it's only really prevalent, that sort of technology, for the large disputes. There is quite heavy investment up front in building that model, in analysing it in terms of time. So really, I would argue that if the dispute is less than $5 million, $10 million, I'm very unlikely to see it, that sort of 4D animation used. I have used it and come across it on an energy from waste plant, where what we did was a very simple walkthrough of the as-planned works against the as-built, visualising the two side by side, where there were some intricacies between the civil works and the process installation contractor, particularly around the boiler, which is a very intricate part of an energy waste plant. That was helpful to the tribunal in that case to just explain visually what's occurred. Again, as I said, with its use on live projects, cost is an issue. The other issue is the skill set. Planners need to have a skill set of BIM, of CAD, and integrating that with the planning software. And I think that's going to take perhaps a few years for it really to come to the fore. So it is a trend towards this type of analysis or visualization of delay issues. I still think we're quite a few years away from seeing it being mainstream, from my experience.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm just conscious of the time, and I did have some other questions for the panelists, but what I would like to, maybe we can come back to, what I'd like to do is give the opportunity to some of our attendees to ask some questions. So if you'll excuse me, I just want to open the Q&A box, and please feel free to add to these.
Yeah, Andy, we've got one question that's coming currently.
Yeah, yeah, I've got it.
Have you got it? Do you want to talk? Do you want to read it?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I'll manage it. Thank you. Paul's used to looking after me and technology. Thanks, mate. This is from Brinner. How can employer-induced delay and the force majeure, we're talking COVID-19 here, induced delay be treated? How can it be analysed, and is the delay separable? Well, I'm going to answer this very briefly, is that we've been successful, it's a bit of an advert as well, I think. HDP have been successful in bringing about successful extension of time claims for our clients for COVID. And one of the things that we had to do was demonstrate the delays that were due to COVID. And this we had to do a very intricate sort of delay analysis. So Tom, if I can bring you in on there, and you can maybe just explain a little bit about what a contractor needs to do in terms of his claim to bring about in terms of the delay analysis part of his claim to bring about a successful claim for COVID.
Thank you, Andy. I think firstly, I guess record keeping is key. A number of the COVID claims we've seen are not backed up with sufficient records. There's almost just an assumption that delays have arisen, but we can't prove there's a reduction in labour resources on site and such like. I think secondly, in response to the question, I think the question was almost about concurrency between employer delay and perhaps a neutral event such as COVID. How do you untangle that? And I think that is a real challenge. I think that, you know, the aim is to look at it on a month-by-month basis, almost a time slice type of analysis, to see what was the status of the works prior to COVID, how late was the project at that point in time, what were the causes of that delay, and then on a month-by-month basis thereafter, try and untangle the effect of COVID from any other delays that are prevalent on that site. And I think it comes down largely to you know, delay being a matter of fact and what the facts say, as much as to what the program analysis says. You know, and as I say, if the records aren't there to prove it's COVID over anything else, then, you know, do you have a case that all of the critical delay that's been suffered is down to COVID or not? We've certainly seen challenges in that front in terms of the record keeping. We've also interestingly seen a number of contractors try and claim all of their delays as a result of COVID, even though in some cases they were in delay prior to COVID, commencing in March of 2020. And there's a challenge there for them, because obviously if COVID is deemed the critical cause of delay, under most contracts, my understanding is that's time, relief from time, or liquidated damages, but not recovery of costs. So, you know, it's a real challenge for certain contractors in trying to untangle it, trying to work out what they can recover costs for, and equally what they can only recover time for. But it is very fact specific, and, you know, you do need good records, which we have seen, as you said, in the instance of the example you quoted, but in other cases we haven't. That presents more of a challenge.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, thanks, Tom, is that, you know, when we first started looking on behalf of clients in terms of COVID-related claims, we had to think out of the box very, very quickly. And for COVID claims, we had to really redo the way that we did our claims. I mean, generally you've got a delay or a couple of days. It's a variation instruction, lack of access, or whatever. And it's one event that we need to build into some sort of delay analysis. Whereas for COVID, it's affected everything: design, procurement, shipping, transport, testing and commissioning, lack of manpower, disruption through having to social distance while you are working. It's also affected the suppliers, the manufacturers, the subcontractors. So, you know, Tom and his team have done an awful lot of work into analysing the delays that were attributable to COVID and separating that from delays that were from other reasons. And as Tom said, if you were late before COVID had an effect, no, you can't claim for those delays. And we would never recommend our clients try to do that. So thanks for that. Mr. Bodur from Tajikistan, nice of you to join us. And another question: can the contractor still claim for COVID-19 impact when the EMP, I assume that means employer Bodur, has already provided a green corridor and no restriction on transportation of goods, materials, and even personnel from abroad and from the country, especially when the entire material to be used for construction of the dam, I actually do know the project that Bodur's talking about, is local materials, and it has no problem of availability of materials. I think what Bodur is saying is that in his particular region, the government has lifted any restrictions on the contractor from working. So it's not being forced to stay at home. There's no transport or communication issues. And most of the work is being sourced from the region. I guess, Bodur, you know, like everything else, you've got to look at cause and effect. And if the contractor can demonstrate that COVID has delayed something, maybe an overseas supply item, maybe some manufacture or equipment, yes, it would be, under most forms of contract that we've looked at, probably entitled to an extension of time claim. But he's got to prove in his claim that he has actually been delayed, and that delay was caused by COVID. I want to bring Paul in on this one as well, because, you know, we're dealing with this all the time. You got anything to add there, Paul?
Yeah, just simply that, as I think everyone's picked up, you know, COVID-19 is not a panacea to recovery of all delays pre-COVID and post-COVID. I think it's very, very concerning that, you know, the clients that we're working with and advising don't seem to understand the separation between the delays and where the project was at prior to the impact of COVID and what's happened and the interlink between delivery of, as you've suggested there, Andy, off-site materials, et cetera, particularly in this sector, you know, huge employer vendor type equipment, which has suffered to be delivered to projects because of COVID and shipping. And linking that back into the COVID situation. And I think that's having good records. You know, the old mantra there of Mr. Abrahamson, you know, it's this goes without saying, and, you know, we will continue to have these problems I see going forward.
Well, we have no more questions now, and that brilliantly brings us to the time when we, the end of our timetable. I was going to say the time, but everybody's in different time zones there. So I'll hand over back to you, Paul, for the closeout. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you, Andy. That was an interesting panel discussion, and I was interested to hear the views of different individuals around the technical side, the legal side, the jurisdictional side, and obviously from the contracting organisation side. So I think hopefully the audience have found the webinar of interest. I think I would just like to add that as an industry, no matter whether it's the energy sector or other construction sectors, we need to continue to work together and support the long-term health of our sector constructively by helping to resolve disputes and working together collaboratively to ensure that the disputes are settled amicably and that cash flow continues to flow through our industry. So I'd like to thank the speakers, Theresa, thank you very much indeed, Philip, John, Tom and Andy for hosting and moderating the panel. I'd also like to thank Stuart and Annie from Limeslade for helping facilitate this session. And I wish you all the very best. Keep safe and take care. Bye-bye for now.